Around 15 years ago, people thought the BRICS, or Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, were rising to rule the world, displacing the old Western powers as exemplified by the United States, European Union, and all that. This was treated just as a fact of the world that denying would make you an idiot. As of this video's production in 2023, with a partial exception, all of these countries have failed in one way or another. A majority are in horrifying recessions right now, some the worst in their historic record. A majority are also slated for mass famine, massive population decline, and state collapse. Meanwhile, the United States sits on top of it all, with economic and population growth outstripping all of them, with continued cultural, economic, political, military, and technological predominance that barely wavered. Wait, what the hell just happened? The story of the BRICS is such a strange rabbit hole. However, once you look into it, you see a picture of deliberate lies, misconstruals, and lost dreams that show how often our understandings of the world are guided by what various special interests want to believe, what the current luck of the moment is, and how devilishly hard it is to play the game of betting against God, that is, predicting the future. From the start, the BRICS were a bad investment made by people who wanted quick returns and didn't understand the value of long-term investing, simply looking for a quick buck. It takes time for an economy to grow, and businesses with a good model don't crop up overnight. And sometimes, even promising business models aren't enough. Last year, companies that have shaped the way a generation processes its daily lives lost trillions of dollars in value that took decades to build. At one point, these companies combined were the 14th largest economy in the world, so as they declined in value, so did the portfolios of nearly every major institution, hedge fund, and investing platform. But there is another way. There is a market whose prices outpaced the S&P 500 in 2022 when it appreciated on average 35%, the contemporary art market, and now you can access it in minutes without needing millions of dollars, thanks to Masterworks. Masterworks paid out tens of millions of dollars to their investors last year, and that's not a one-off. Every Masterworks exit has returned a profit to investors. With 650,000 plus users, Masterworks offerings have sold out in minutes. They even have had to make a wait list for new users, but I got special access for you guys to skip that, so click the link in the description right now. The first reason for why the BRICS failed is that they never existed in the first place. Let me repeat that. The BRICS have never been a thing. That's a bit harsh, though. These countries do meet up once a year to discuss their shared interests and what they're working on right now. However, it's not at all comparable to organizations like NATO, the European Union, and the like, which often work like transnational empires, in many cases since they're extensions of the American empire and are part of Western civilization. Watching the Europeans cope about me saying that in the comments is gonna be so much fun. However, the thing that lots of people overvalue or do not understand about diplomacy outside the Pax Americana, or countries that are tied to the US's political and cultural power, is that diplomacy is inherently multi-sided, and an alliance, talks, or anything like that does not mean very much in of itself. Let's just look at India and China's relationship as a single example. India and China are both part of the BRICS, being the I and the C, and India is also part of China's what really amounts to colonial project of the Belt and Road scheme. India also commonly buys military equipment from China's ally Russia, and the two could be considered allies. From all this, you would suspect that China and India would be strong allies, right? However, the reality is that these countries have threatened war with each other several times in the last few years, with skirmishes between them in the Himalayas killing hundreds of people. China is trying to dam up India's water supply in the Himalaya mountains, and both are actively cultivating alliances, navies, and foreign policies against the other country, and by all accounts despise each other. However, in these separate organizations, they can pretend to be buddies. This degree of complexity of working with several different partners at once is common in the second and third worlds, since it geopolitically makes sense. People often say a country like Thailand, Turkey, the Philippines, or Brazil have made a decisive turn towards Russia, China, or America, But like a girl with many suitors, they're incentivized to play off different countries in order to get as many goodies as possible as they compete for influence. Erdogan and Turkey would rotate between Russian, European, Chinese, and American influence, as well as other factions in the Middle East depending on Turkey's needs at that very moment. You can see a similar thing in Pakistan, where on paper Pakistan is a strong US ally. However, in real terms, Pakistan is receiving massive amounts of funding from China, which has announced an Iron Brotherhood, and America does not trust Pakistan at all. This shows how the BRICS could exist on paper theoretically, but actually have no impact on the ground. Let's just run through what relationships each of the countries in the BRICS have to each other to show how unreal it is. Brazil's largely an American ally. It's not especially a strong one, but it's still there. Brazil doesn't have lots of foreign entanglements and is largely self-contained, but used to trade a tremendous amount of its natural resources to the Chinese market. Thus, it served for Brazilians to respect China. Russia's in an alliance with China, although one rife with massive mistrust, and the Chinese Communist Party has a significant faction that wants to annex Siberia, and both know it's a relationship of convenience against the Americans. You can see the weakness in that China has not supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine at all. Russia and India are weak allies, but that gets trumped by India's top ally being the Americans, who are Russia's biggest enemy. As said before, India and China despise each other. South Africa, meanwhile, is geopolitically a non-entity, as we'll explain later. South Africa has taken some money from the Chinese, like most of Africa, but to say they're actually a strong ally would be going way too far. From all this, the idea of the BRICS as a shared coalition in any way like NATO or how the Warsaw Pact used to be is completely ridiculous. Let me explain to you how the idea of the BRICS started. It was when the chairman of Goldman Sachs encouraged it in 2001 as a way to promote investment in those countries, which people would hopefully do through Goldman Sachs. Like a couple other things, it was an advertising scheme that went way too well. The idea of the BRICS and their rise to global success was pushed by 3 separate interest groups that benefited from the idea, and there was no group that pushed against it, so it just became conventional knowledge. The first group, as alluded to before, is financial types. The early 2000s were the era of the most capital or cheap money for investment in all of human history. This was since it was a time with the highest percentage of middle-aged people ever, and wide-scale wealth. Middle-aged people invest in the stock market to save up for retirement, thus resulting in the stock market growing to a truly massive percentage of the world's economy over the last 30 years, and money funding insane projects. Since there was so much capital in developed economies, it flooded outwards to look for returns in developing countries since there was more of an ability to take risks. The financiers involved wanted the BRICS to succeed since many had invested in those countries and thus their success would generate large amounts of money for them as individuals. There was a lot of thinking in financial circles at the time that went like, if I can sell a washing machine to every family in China or India, I will be the richest man in the world, not realizing some Chinese or Indian guy would pirate your design and sell it in his home country better and more cheaply than you can. In all fairness, to a really big degree, this did pan out. The years between 1980 and 2020 were those of the fastest economic growth and reduction in poverty in the whole world by a really massive margin, concentrated significantly in the developing world. However, as this video will show, this did not pan out in the ways that the people expected for a variety of reasons. The second group that this was pushed by was self-hating Western academics. A significant part, if not a majority, of the West ruling class is self-loathing, and bases its right to power off the West being fundamentally broken. The idea of the global South, as they call it, catching up and surpassing the developed world, is greeted with applause in academia and much of the media and bureaucracy as a just revenge for colonialism, even though that entails their societies losing. You didn't see many people writing in academia about the West's inherent cultural and systemic advantages in the early 2000s, while you saw lots of inflating of the value and strengths of developing nations, thus creating a skewed intellectual view. Today, the internet in a lot of ways has replaced academia as a center for new intellectual thought for most people, but that really wasn't the case at the time, with academia holding a monopoly on most thinking. The third group being the developing world's elites themselves, which pretty obviously benefited from the belief in being a strong, successful, unified front rising against the established order. Leaders in China, Russia, Brazil, and the rest stood to gain massively from beating their chests about being the wave of the future. Another thing to consider is that all of these societies are more collectivist, shame-driven, and less open than Western ones, meaning they will downplay their weaknesses and overplay their strengths in the public view, while the Western world does the exact opposite. In the developing world since the start of the 20th century, there's been this push to try to form ludicrous alliances against the developed world of extremely disparate countries on paper that actually have no power or coherency. A great example of this is the Japanese co-prosperity sphere, where the Japanese said they were working for all Asians while actually trying to build an empire that would allow them to exploit other Asians. Mao Zedong invented the term Third World, actually, and sent money and experts all over the world to try to build an alliance against the Soviets or Americans. Other examples are Pan-Africanism, Third World Socialism, Pan-Arabism, and more. When you get a meeting with Indonesia, Libya, Angola, and Brazil into the same room, they're not going to accomplish anything except boosting egos. Most former colonial countries have psychological pathologies that stem from originally being proud countries, and in many cases viewing themselves as the center of the world, while afterward the Europeans smashed their entire worldview, while in many cases also providing democracy, rule of law, science, modern militaries, and the sort. The complicated feelings of inferiority means that lots of these countries pose more than they really need to as an overcompensation for colonialism. Lots of these countries also have strong ideas of face as well, viewing putting up a good exterior to the outside world as a moral good in of itself. All of this added together creates a series of special interests that were able to push the idea of the BRICS without much reality behind it. The BRICS started meeting up and journalists herald their rise to dominance at the expense of the Western world. The funny thing is that I'm 21, and a big part of my audience is even younger than I am, and partially since both of my parents are really into politics, but even I as a 10-year-old remember how big the hype was. I remember walking around Philly as a 13-year-old thinking about how America was doomed to obscurity, while China would replace us, and it was the duty of me and my generation to prevent that. I remember hearing in school the truism that America was in decline, which was just treated as obviously true, and the second and third worlds would gradually replace us and become our sugar daddies, while we lost all our vigor. I remember CNN's Fareed Zakaria, who is a great encapsulation of all three of the interest groups above, of Western academia, money, and third world elites, in one, writing out how the rest would surely catch up. As a perfect example of the storm that never came, my school started teaching Mandarin as a foreign language when I was in middle school, and the year after I left high school they replaced it with French. One of the things that people really ought to be very careful of is looking at information sources with a bias and then cherry-picking evidence for what their theory is already. To be brutally fair, literally everyone does this, and it's by all accounts impossible not to do with human nature. Then, when the exact opposite thing happens, everyone's flabbergasted. Think of a boy who's madly in love with a girl and so views the innocuous things she does as flirting, or how all the smartest people in the mid-20th century thought by 2000 everyone would be starving from overpopulation, but instead 2 billion people are obese, and the issue staring down the human race is mass depopulation. I'm going to go through each of the BRICS to explain why they failed, through which showing the nature of the modern geopolitical world. Let's have some fun. Number 1. Brazil. I'm part Canadian and I've lived there for a second, and there's an interesting time in the 2010s when Canadians sat on a really high horse about having a better economy than America, saying this was due to their innate character and growing power as a nation. 10 years later, Canada is an authoritarian shitshow where GDP per capita is less than 3/4 of the US. This is exactly what happened to Brazil, but worse. I'm always shocked that economics is by far the academic discipline our society puts the most effort into. You see far more economists as a percentage of public intellectuals compared to other eras of history than there ever really have been. However, since economics has become tied to power, the discipline of economics has not really been free to do good research and merely parrots what their paymasters want. This will be a consistent theme in this video. However, one big thing that always shocks me is that in the era when the BRICS were super big, no one looked at resource prices. Brazil is fundamentally a colonial economy, as all of Latin America is in general, and as Canada or Australia are as well. Brazil is an economically important country, but largely due to raw material exports. Brazil is blessed with raw resources, especially iron, tin, and phosphate, and fertile soil, being one of the world's greatest exporters of cereals, soy, sugar, tropical crops, as well as beef. East Asia and Europe are both inextricably linked with Brazil economically. In the early 2000s, China was experiencing the most rapid economic growth ever in the history of the world, and the largest driving sector of the Chinese economy was real estate, thus resulting in truly massive prices for raw materials due to the massive surge from the Chinese economy. The Chinese used the equivalent of the city of Rome's concrete every single year for a decade, and in that same decade used as much cement as the entirety of the US's whole history. The Chinese also moved up from being starving peasants to being a real market for food and especially meat. The Chinese responded to the 2008 financial crisis in the West by having a massive production and construction binge in order to stimulate their economy, which worked remarkably well, with China completely missing out on that recession. This meant that resource-producing countries did unbelievably well in that era by feeding China. Due to this, Australia has not had a single recession in the last 40 years, and that's why Canada, for a bit, had a higher average income than the US. This applied to Brazil, which was flooded with immense wealth and hope. All of the resources Brazil exported were incredibly expensive. People often said Brazil was the country of the future and would gradually replace the US as a great economy. Wealthy Brazilians would go to New York or Miami for insane shopping sprees. This sounds ridiculous today, but people genuinely believed it. A good proxy for countries that people overhype is where the Olympics or World Cup is held. Brazil had both in 2016 and 2014, respectively. However, by the time these came along, it all looked incredibly ironic. In 2014, the year it held the World Cup, Brazil's economy crashed to the worst rates ever in its historic record, which has largely held for the decade since. China was having an economic slowdown and was also transitioning away from early industrialization, which prioritizes mass construction, to try and later fail to transition to a more complex value-added economy. This crushed all the resource-based economies, including Brazil. Millions of Brazilians who had risen out of poverty into the global middle class horrifically slid back into it. At the same time, Brazilian President Lula, attached with 200 leading officials in government and private enterprise, circling around the Brazilian state oil company, was committing possibly the largest corruption case in the history of the whole world. Around $2 billion were stolen. Brazil then elected its own equivalent to Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, who was a right-wing demagogue promising to fix Brazil's economy and bring back the old days. In some ways, it's very reminiscent of the US, where there was a tight 2022 election between two very disliked candidates, while the political environment felt extremely tense. Brazilian friends have told me it feels like a civil war could happen. Like America, the left, led by old President Lula, who we talked about before, was narrowly able to gain power. I don't think there was really any excuse for overvaluing Brazil in the early 2000s, except for the interests of these three groups mentioned before. If someone had read any Latin American history, they could see the predicament Brazil was in. All Latin American countries except Mexico are all, in effect, colonial resource-dependent economies, and so they look really good when resource prices are high, and then completely collapse when resource prices do. You can literally project when Colombia is going to be a democracy based off what the price of coffee is. This is held for 150 years. Latin America has been stuck in this trap for 300 years. Although Latin America has made some impressive gains, their percent of the world economy has remained constant over the last 100 years, and their relative wealth versus the US has remained constant for 200 years. Brazil has two separate systemic problems. The first, which I talk about in this video about Latin American civilization, is that due to its Iberian cultural heritage, there's naturally a large amount of corruption and inefficiency, and at the same time, their Latin aristocratic heritage treats working as dishonorable, while in Anglo countries, not working is considered disgusting. The second reason, and this is something that I've talked about in all sorts of previous episodes, is slavery is one of the worst things you can do in a society, and is in effect a social cancer. And Brazil has practiced slavery in its history the most of almost any country in the world. And Brazil was fundamentally built upon slavery, and Your average Brazilian is some mix of African ancestry, so it's difficult to remove Brazilian society from those roots. A final thing is that Brazil is one of the very unlucky countries that urbanized and thus crashed its birth rate before it could industrialize and thus become wealthy. Brazil's birth rate has crashed, and thus their economic prospects are dim for decades going forward, as they will struggle with an aging population. At the same time, their main market of Europe and the Far East are both projected to lose half their population over the next 60 plus years, meaning demand for their goods will crash. Brazil had a serious opportunity to invest in real assets and physical, actual things that would pay back their wealth in the early 2000s when they had that money, but that opportunity was completely wasted. Number 2, Russia. I really like the comparison of Russia and Brazil since they're countries that are in many ways very similar. Both are massive Western adjacent countries with some of the highest inequality rates, run by oligarchs, are corrupt and economically based off exporting a couple resources, and are projected for dark times due to population decline. 150 years ago, you could have projected where Brazil is today, since it would be doing the exact same thing. However, Russia is a much more sad story with clear lost potential. As I talk about in this video, Russia has always been the country that has been so close to becoming a wealthy and fair place, and then makes the wrong call. Before World War I, Russia was rapidly industrializing, gaining income, and liberalizing. Russia was a massive cultural powerhouse, with a rapidly growing population, was the terror of all its neighbors. Russia was on track to become the largest economy in the world. However, the Soviets seized power. Don't get me wrong, Russia massively grew in importance under the Soviets, with them conquering all of Central Europe and fully industrializing, but to be fair, every industrial country grew massively in the early 20th century, so that's not really special. However, the Soviets, especially under Stalin, gutted every social institution by wiping out the religion, successful peasant class, private business, universities, artists, independent military, the family, and by the time Stalin died, the only thing that still worked well in the Soviet Union was the secret police. Societies are living, breathing organisms, and the things mentioned above are what allowed them to prosper. Russia, in effect, committed suicide as a society by killing all of its effective social organisms, and instead became a herd corralled by guns and brainwashed from childhood. Russia has spent centuries building up social capital under the czars, which Stalin unwisely burnt. You can see this in just the human character of Russia, going from 7 children per family in World War I to having an unsustainable birth rate in the 1970s. The average lifespan in Russia collapsed due to mass alcoholism over the last couple decades. When the Soviet Union fell, Russia was a liberal democracy for a couple years and then became a dictatorship run by the secret police, who were the only functioning organism, with Putin being former secret police under the Soviets, and who has de facto run Russia for my entire life. Putin was able to stabilize Russia from the post-Soviet chaos and remains popular from this, but has also strangled the country of its possible potential. In classic Russian fashion, Putin cares more about maintaining power than the quality of life, and rules through oligarchs who purchase the old Soviet state corporations, who he uses to stabilize control of the society, which is in effect deviating back to the pre-18th century status quo, where the monarchy worked with the nobility to control the society. Russia is an incredibly unequal country where the elite live in insane luxury, while the society works for no one else. Russia has no industrial competitiveness, and its industrial base is useless, being built off the Soviets. Russia briefly looked good for the reason Brazil did, due to high resource prices in the early 2000s. In Russia's case, this was agriculture and natural gas. However, I also don't understand why people were bullish on this country. Its educated class was fleeing en masse to the West. Its elite trusts it so little that there are more Russian rubles outside Russia, sitting in bank accounts in Britain, Panama, or Cyprus than inside the nation of Russia. It lacks the preconditions for economic growth like rule of law. Like Brazil, if you looked for a second anything besides resource prices, you would see this. In fact, the Russians were very happy to become part of the BRICS because it would allow them to associate with the other countries that were experiencing economic growth, while Russia was not in the same category. There are some things where you should give the Russians credit. They were able to stabilize and keep their standard of living pretty good after the economic crash, unlike many of the other countries on this list, and the cost of living is not that high in Russia. At the same time, they've recently been able to stabilize their birth rate, but nowhere near to the degree that won't cause their end over the next few years. Again, like Brazil, Russia's economy crashed in 2014 due to resource price collapse, immediately followed by Russia's invasion of Crimea, which further hurt its economic prospects. Putin did this to unify his country during the recession, blacklisted by the rest of the world due to the first war in Crimea, and 7 years later this was completed with the invasion of Ukraine. Russia is now almost completely isolated from the world's economy, which will likely cause a crisis due to natural gas and agricultural reliance on Russia, as I talk about in this video. Russia is also in a very ugly position now with its demographics. Russia's population is slated to halve over the next 60 years. A country like this cannot survive with two 70-year-olds for every 25-year-old. Russia's staring down civil war, state collapse, and all that over the next couple decades. Number 3, India. Interestingly, of every country on this list, India has the best future ahead of it, which is probably not what anyone expected at the start of this century. However, in their classic fashion, India always plays the moderate political and economic path, steering away from the very high growth of earlier in this century, but also not facing the issues that we're having now. As they are the only country on this list without a major crisis staring them down, India again fulfills the rule I've posited of always being the country that's the exception to every rule. I was thinking about what witty quip I could make up for India's history like I did for Brazil and Russia, but fuck it. I spent an hour trying to explain Indian civilization, and I only feel like I cracked the surface. India is easily the most complicated country in the world, with hundreds of gods, castes, languages, ethnicities, and more. India was a chaotic civilization that skipped out on the axial age leveling package of monotheism and bureaucratic empires, thus keeping the insane degree of complexity that the Bronze Age world had into the 21st century, while then being horrifically pwned by the Muslims and the British, who left them with the scaffolding of a modern democracy, bureaucracy, and science, with Gandhi providing the new spirit for the new republic. India went through a socialist phase in the Cold War era as a reaction to British hyper-capitalism, which caused tens of millions of death and famine. India remained deeply poor and was slated for mass famine, but with the invention of GMOs and the introduction of capitalism in the late 20th century, India was looking to be in pretty good shape at the start of this century. My researcher Seamus did a project on the Indian economy today, or what the fruits of modernization have been, and the results are really unique. Tropical countries like Brazil earlier tend to have incomprehensible bureaucracies that make mass coordination impossible, and this is what happened with India. Thus, India's actual industry has not grown at all in the last 40 years. Unlike the previous two countries, India does have rule of law, but its bureaucracy is so incomprehensible as to make big projects impossible. India's growth has been concentrated in services and its upper classes. This makes sense considering India's at least 5,000-year history of the caste system, which prioritizes the upper classes. India has really advanced technological sectors, service industries with despised call centers being an example, and all of that sort of thing. Strangely enough, for a process called industrialization, India has not seen a lot of industry and is being led by soft service industries. The report shows a disturbing picture of a two-tiered Indian society. As the movie The White Tiger, which is really fun to watch, says, those with bellies and those without. Most people in India, like almost all countries today, have not seen their standard of living improve at all in the last 40 years. In fact, mechanization stands to destroy India's peasant classes, without new factories arising to provide them jobs in the cities. And educational standards in Indian public schools have not improved at all in the last 40 years. India has all the preconditions of a severe social crisis that Turchin uses to predict revolutions and civil wars. This includes elite overpopulation or having lots of educated Indians unable to gain better jobs due to the top 0.1% getting more and more wealth. When elite aspirants can't get positions, you should be very worried since they get radicalized, start political crises, or flood my comment section with unhinged Indian nationalist comments. My favorite author, Amaury Duriancourt, wrote in the 60s that India was a country best positioned for fascism in the next century, and I agree with the Hindu nationalist BJP being a weak representation of this impulse. India is remarkably self-contained for a country of its massive scale of over 1 billion. It's self-sufficient for food, which is incredibly impressive, but it also barely trades with any of its neighbors and exercises basically negative foreign policy influence. Every single country neighboring India is a Chinese ally, with Bangladesh and Pakistan slated for Chinese naval bases. The Chinese are literally trying to dam up the water supply for northeast India or the Brahmaputra River. However, none of that's actually that bad, and of all the countries on this list, even if India has a civil war or becomes a fascist dictatorship, it's still the best positioned country here. It's the only one which is not having a major demographic crisis and will never have a resource or industrial crisis. India has never ever been a great power, with Indian armies never attacking outwards once in the country's 4,000-year history. India's poor have always been poor and downtrodden and have no real expectations of anything else, meaning India can shove off and deal with major crises without breaking its social structure. Number 4. China. I've already covered China in this video, and so I'm going to keep this one short. China is in the past by far the most impressive of the BRICS, being a literal economic majority of the entire BRICS net worth. And if you remove India, it has 3 times more people than all those other BRICS combined. If you want to judge off the historic record as well, China's an optimistic bet, being the largest economy and country in the world for almost all of human history, and China's economic growth over the last 40 years is the largest ever in all of human history. In 1976, China had a smaller economy than Spain, and is now by some metrics the largest in the world, surpassing even the United States. However, at the same time, China is experiencing what will become a massive dynastic and social collapse, which will consume them for decades, killing hundreds of millions. That's big talk, but let me show you why I think that. China has very strong fundamentals. It's 94% the same ethnicity, it's in the temperate zone, and its people are naturally educated, loyal, entrepreneurial, and hardworking. In any given profession, there is probably some part of China that is in competition to be the best area in the world at that thing, in the same way the US can do. The Communist Party liberalized in the late 20th century, and China is largely growing by importing Western industry. I remember looking at my toys and seeing all of them were made in China, and thus assuming China must be a great country. For the longest time, China was the country that made everything, although in recent years a combination of Southeast Asia and the US have been surpassing them. The Chinese were growing at an unbelievable rate, spawning technical sectors, truly massive cities, and all that at a speed that no one could believe. Everyone thought the Chinese would take over the world, and it looked like this as well. China became a massive soft powerhouse, becoming the main influencer in most of Africa, Asia, and even parts of Latin America. The Chinese resurrected the Mongol Empire as an alliance against the American world order. In order to understand where the Chinese went wrong from this high point, we need to look at the pre-existing example of Japan, which I'm surprised no one's looked to. Japan in the 60s through 80s was an economic titan. Japan was a massive technological and economic powerhouse, with Japan being an incredibly wealthy country and even buying up large parts of the American economy like the Chinese have. Crazy as it sounds, for a long period of time, Japan was the second biggest economy in the world. People were talking about Japan as the next great power. However, in 1991, the Japanese real estate market bubbled and fell apart, and the Japanese economy has scarcely grown an inch in the 30 years since. What went wrong? Japan followed the 2 same errors of China. The first is that its elite was too coherent and thus didn't have enough dissent. The Japanese printed a ludicrous amount of money to fund their economic growth, with coercion between the banks, government, and corporations. When this financial scheme stopped working, as all bubbles do, they were toast and they ran out of gas. China is the exact same today, but it's much worse. The Chinese money printing is by far the largest and most outrageous ever in the course of human history. You can even see the results with the incredibly overinflated Japanese and Chinese real estate markets before their crashes. Speaking of gas, Confucian countries have similar demographic structures over time. They concentrate their population growths over a single hyper-powered generation, and then don't have any children after that. The Japanese had lots of young people until 1990, when they started to age and their economy went bust. The reason the Japanese never recovered is that they just didn't have enough young people. China is in the exact same condition, but again worse. In many ways, it's useful to view the Chinese-Japanese relationship like that between the United States and Britain, where the same trends as manifested in Britain manifest in the US to a much larger degree, and because those trends are happening in such a larger arena, they can become like a black hole or vortex just due to the scale difference. China has a giant bracket of people in their late 30s and not really any group younger than that. This demographic in their late 30s or early 40s has no children, can't afford to retire or get a home. Their bodies also can't keep up with the 12-hour shifts in China that are common. As this demographic ages without a future, China's just screwed. China's birth rate at this point is literally a quarter of what it would need to be stable. China's population will halve over the next 60 years, thus resulting in the collapse of their society. At the same time, China's manufacturing relationship with America, which underlaid 42% of its economy, was broken starting with the Trump administration. The US started a tariff war with China, followed by a collapse in relations and China's alienation of the Western world, which is half of the world's economy, let I remind you. China has lost industrial competitivity, with lower value production going to cheaper Southeast Asian countries as Chinese workers ask for higher wages, while the more complex stuff going back to the United States, which experienced one of the most rapid reindustrializations ever. China then started down the road of totalitarianism, with Xi assuming more and more dictatorial power. China started threatening war with India and America on a regular basis. China had brutal lockdowns that resulted in destroying internal trade, promulgating mass famine, stopped foreign trade, foreign education, ushering in a supposed new era of Maoism. China is now experiencing the largest riots ever since Tiananmen Square. China's economy is completely unsustainable, with a incredibly ludicrously overblown housing sector where normal Chinese will work 20 years to get a four-sided concrete shack without water, electricity, or heating. China has lots of bizarre, corrupt practices that seem out of the 17th century, like forbidding internal immigration, local governments can only raise taxes through real estate, the military has its own factories and farms, or selling military and political offices. Inequality is higher than any of the Western capitalist countries, and workers have less rights, which is ironic for a supposedly communist nation. There is a lot of reason for revolution in China. China has a hard road ahead. Number 5. South Africa. South Africa was jotted on after the BRICS were already formed. I think this was out of convenience, since you can just add an S easily to make it a plural, and people also probably felt racist for not having an African country. Likewise, there's always been a big squad of people bullish on Africa, and South Africa was symbolic at that time for that crew of people. People also liked Mandela, who I think is objectively a great man, and wanted to act as if his project was still working. None of that made it a good decision, though. South Africa is not a real country. It was a tool of European colonialism, with the unifying factor being the white ruling class. The country is split racially east-west, and there are many sub-nations in South Africa that are better served as independent or even joining their co-ethnics in neighboring countries. Once that white ruling class lost power in South Africa, the country really had no reason to exist. Apartheid ended much better than anyone involved expected. Instead of the horrifying race war most people predicted, the black Africans had a great and moral leader of Mandela, who whites were willing to peacefully hand power over to. Once South Africa became a full suffrage democracy, the whites, who now stand at 7% of the population, lost electoral power, while remaining wealthy and the main economic drivers. The biggest problem in South Africa is the coexistence of an industrial European civilization inhabiting the same region as an African that could have existed before the birth of Christ. The differences in education, attitude, and everything else is thousands of years. Due to this, South Africa has the highest inequality and crime rate of any nation on Earth. It is some incredibly heartbreaking and rending poverty. The ruling party, the ANC, or African National Congress, has maintained power by pulling on its rural poor supporters, and bases its right to rule off giving goodies to its constituencies. It's already started repossessing the white ruling class's farmlands to small black farmers, and its campaign promises are to finish this promise. For a frame of reference of when this happened in Zimbabwe, it resulted in turning the country from a breadbasket to one where large parts of the population were starving and the currency was hyperinflated, so they had dollar bills numbering in the trillions. South Africa under apartheid was economically insulated from the rest of the world, and none of its industries are competitive. South Africa really has nothing going for it except for resources like diamonds. The problem with economic growth in Africa is the absence of preconditions like rule of law, education, a history of a work ethic, linear time, and strong clans. For an example of this, South Africa's former president, Jacob Zuma, took $30 million in taxpayer funds to renovate his mansion. He also raped an activist against him, and when she told him she had AIDS, he said he took a shower and washed it off. South Africa's social problems, including drought, rural overpopulation, and poverty, are horrifying. South Africa won't survive as a unified country in the next 30 years, let alone be Africa's future titan. This was the worst call of any in the BRICS. There are a couple things we should learn from the story of the BRICS. The first is that you have to ignore hype. With everything from the trans movement to NFTs or modern monetary theory, our age likes to paint what's clearly a cow as a horse, and then be completely shocked when you try to ride the cow like a horse and then fail. If you read a single book on most of these countries' histories, you could see what their fundamental problems would be in calling them the power of the future or good long-term investments. However, like so many other things, investors bought into the hype and them doing very well for only a couple years. A theme I will bring up a lot on this show is try to just use common sense and not let yourself be confused by people who look smart or the hype. Also, the interesting thing is that there were countries that were overlooked that have relatively bright futures. In fact, for each of the failed BRICS, there's an alternative that was actually sustainable. Brazil failed, but Mexico became an industrial powerhouse, and Colombia pulled its shit together. Russia didn't do so great, but East Central European countries like Poland, the Baltics, Czechia, Hungary, and Romania experienced downright stunning economic growth, now being fully developed economies. Loads of businesses relocated from China to Southeast Asia, with many people saying Vietnam feels like China did 10 years ago. When South Africa failed, Ethiopia was able to industrialize and Kenya became the economic center of all East Africa. To use a cliché example from fairy tales, don't miss the gem in the mud for the flashy option that looks good but won't go the distance. The nations and people in general that succeed over the long haul, rather than just having some luck they'll burn, or those that save, work hard, act fairly, and all those other things we intuitively know to be good principles. All the BRICS looked attractive since they had insane growth for that very second, often due to taking shortcuts that would screw them over in the long term, while those countries mentioned before didn't, thus setting them up for slower but more real and durable growth. On a statistical basis, a country that experiences extremely fast growth over a short period is also very likely to have a horrifying economic crash afterwards. Finally, the ultimate joke is that the previous country, which the narrative said was in decline, ended up beating all the rivals. The United States remains preeminent in every field, experiencing rapid reindustrialization, while it has the healthiest demographic future of any developed country. In the modern world, we always forget constants and think the entire universe can be turned upside down in an instant. However, if a country has been successful for centuries and others have failed for centuries, there's normally a long-standing reason for that which will not change in a matter of a single decade.